my innocence. I slept in this nursery. I stared out this window at the orchard. I woke up happy every morning. It looked exactly the same then. Nothing's changed. All white. Oh, my orchard. After the dark and dank autumn and cold, cold winter.
Yes, a cold, cold winter. Have you had enough of that yet? But we're here not to talk about the weather. We're here to talk about the winter or the weather. We're here to talk about genre. Though genre is like the weather. You always have it, right? It's not like you never have weather. You always have, or you ever not have weather. You always have some kind of weather. Even when there seems to be no weather, we say it's just calm. It's like that with genre as well. There's always a genre operating, right? To structure our expectations as we go about reading a text. We walk up to a poem, we say, that's a poem. And all of a sudden we're reading it in a certain way that we wouldn't read it if we said, that's a novel, right? And this is something that Fowler gets into in his difficult and abstract essay that I wanted you to have a stab at, take a stab at anyway. Fowler calls our attention to modern concepts of meaning, such as Dan Sperber and Deidre Wilson's theory of relevance. As Sperber and Wilson have made very clear, Fowler writes, coding and decoding, and that must include generic codes, play only a limited part in communication and interpretation, which are largely a matter of small-scale inferences guided by relevance. The principle of relevance, which is a rather abstract concept that he introduces, operates at every stage. In the case of literary interpretation, relevance must necessarily be to readers' own cognitive environments, even to their own interests. But, and this is an important but whether they know it or not, they're also continually guided by relevance to what they assume to be the writer's intention. Now, those writer's intentions include genre. Like, what is the writer intending to create here? Is it a poem? Is it a play, a drama? Is it an epic? Is it a narrative? Is it a novel? Is it a short story? And so on. He says parenthetically, these promise, after all, the pleasure of recognizing intended harmonies. And you do get this sense of satisfaction. I suppose it's a form of pleasure that you get when you look at a poem and you recognize perhaps the rhyme scheme, and you realize this is a poem. It's a poem that has a rhyme scheme, one of these recognizable rhyme schemes, like a sonnet. We're going to be talking about sonnets. Generic organization, Fowler continues, may be conjectured to facilitate interpretative inferences at almost every level of structure. And we're going to see some examples of, at a very small level of structure, the individual tiny little micro episode, we see genre operating in such a way as to provide some guidance for us, right? As we go about attempting to apprehend or comprehend the play. The point here is that, to try to pierce through the abstraction a bit, the point here for Fowler's making, and not just Fowler, is that we read a work, as we read a work, our individual interests tend to take a backseat at some point to the interest, so to speak, of the genre of that work, the genre that we decide was intended by the author. Our own individual interests matter little often when we try to make sense of the elements of the work. Genre matters more. The genre that we decide that the writer intends. If we think we're reading a poem, we see an image of a small pig in the poem. Okay, we're going to think of other small pigs, or maybe large pigs large and small, that we've encountered in other poetic works, right? We're also going to think about the suitability of pigs to, shall we say, the sonnet form and the sonnet content. Do pigs tend to be celebrated in sonnets? I think the answer to that typically would be no, right? What we're not going to do is allow our own personal interest in pigs to, this is as we get better as readers, we're not going to allow our personal feelings about pigs, personal attitudes and knowledge of pigs, attitudes towards and knowledge of pigs, to distract us from what we see as the generic game going on, right? And that's why I say, and it's a continuation, of course, of what Fowler is saying and Sperber and Wilson are saying, so much depends upon genre, does it not? Indeed, as Anise S. Barwashi and Mary Jo Reef argue, and this is taken from the actual discussion question that, frankly, I wish more people had gone after. I think a lot of people stuck with trifles this week, which is fine. That was obviously allowed. Barwashi and Reef argue Genres structure our perceptions of literary actions, representations, and identifications, and they do so, quote, at almost every level of structure. And here again, there's this insistence that even on a very micro level, you feel the force of genre. Okay, we're gonna see this play out here in a moment. If you walk up to a play with the idea of a comedy or farce in mind, you'll see comedic elements, even if you don't see comedy writ large, right? Which would be a good test case for this claim. And here we're going to get into something that you guys are saying. Brenton is saying. Brenton is arguing, quote, the subtitle of The Cherry Orchard is A Comedy in 4 Acts. So, to Bawarshi and Reeves' point, Brenton continues, this sets the stage. This generic designation sets the stage for how we should perceive actions throughout the play. I thought that was very well said. Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen as farcical, perhaps. Of course, farce is a subgenre, have another go with that word, of comedy. Tragedy is a competing genre, right? Certain actions will be seen as comedic. They could have been seen perhaps as farcical, perhaps even as tragic. And we're going to see here in this example chosen by Brenton, this sort of choice between the tragic significance of a small event and a more farcical or comedic one. Here's Brenton speaking about Epikhodov, who has the following lines and directions in the final act. Quote, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, isn't worth mending. This is Epikhodov. His forefathers had better have him. I only envy him. Puts a trunk, here's the stage direction, puts a trunk on the hat box and squashes it. This seems to exemplify, Brenton argues, both the glossary of terms, definition of farce as, quote, broad verbal humor and physical bustle and horseplay, and the Norton's definition of farce as, quote, slapstick or other physical humor. But, Brenton continues, read without the context of comedy, specifically farce, and without the stage direction, in other words, if you don't feel the force of comedy as a genre, you don't feel that you're reading a genre, and you're not sort of obedient, as it were, to this generic designation, this generic kind of compulsion almost, which is, as Brenton has already said, was instituted by the subtitle of the play. This line could be seen, right, as serious and malevolent, since it deals with whether the older fierce is worth helping. Go back to it, the aged fierce, in my conclusive opinion, says Epikhodov, isn't worth mending. So it'd just be left on the stage at the end of the play, and nobody will care, right? The line is juxtaposed with the practical gag, though, of the hat box being squashed, which softens the delivery, right? So it can be seen as a very serious kind of statement that it would be proper to a tragic assessment of someone's fall, so to speak. You could say that fierce falls at the end of the play. But then you have to think about that hat box, which makes us feel that, no, we're really reading a comedy. Brenton continues, perhaps this draws a connection between Epikhodov's reckless speech regarding a human being and his reckless actions towards the luggage, which I thought was a nice afterthought that he had. Another example, let's get into another example of the same sort of moment, right, in which it's a tiny moment. That's what I think makes it especially interesting, right? It's a very small little micro moment in which genre, okay, seems to be exerting its force, right, one way or the other, and compelling us to read the play one way or the other in this moment. Or maybe if we are not sure which genre the play is obedient to, which we are in such moments, right, looking for direction, okay? In either case, genre seems to be the most important element, as opposed to some kind of errant thought we might have about what's going on. Even thinking about the theme itself, the question of whether human beings, for example, are ever not worth mending. Is that Chekhov's theme, right? This sort of hopelessness about human nature, right? Something along those lines maybe is interrupted as we try to solve the more basic and fundamental problem of genre. So here's that other example. And this is one in which violence is done to the human body rather than a hat box. How different may various wielding of Fierce's slapstick in Act 3 and her own parasol at the end of Act 4 appear if we were told that we were reading a peculiarly Russian sort of tragedy, as opposed to what we are told we're reading, a comedy in 4 acts. the Russian tragedy, one in which no character dies, that would be the peculiarity of it, because in tragedy, typically somebody dies. Often, as you know, if you've read Shakespeare tragedy, many people die. Maybe Fierce does die at the end of the play, but you can imagine that you might feel that you're reading oh, this is how the Russians do tragedy. It's not so much that people die, houses die. A house does something more than, but including a family. So it's like a family dies, maybe. A house dies. A kind of whole lineage passes. As Veria exclaims, quote, "Yes, life in this house is over. There will be no more of it." I mean, how are we to take that line? Is that like a tremendously tragic line? Or is that a line in which, well, it's just more silliness, Veria being silly? That is a question, unto itself. But getting back to the violence that we see done in this particular scene, we might still find Veria's violence ridiculous, right? When she hits Lopakhin with the stick, or when she brandishes the parasol and he flinches at the very end of the play. But the emphasis, if we feel we're reading a tragedy, even a peculiarly Russian tragedy, might fall on how the stick hurts. Because hurt it does, right? Lopakhin reports an immense bump coming up, unless that's just nonsense and extravagance and exaggeration on the part of Lopakhin, right? Once again, that's the comedic genre exerting itself when I ask that question. You see what I'm saying? We have to recall this is a man who, as a peasant child, was referred to as ignorant, beaten Yermolai. He received emotional bumps much worse than any physical bumps that he might have received, because the emotional bump is so lasting that he flinches. He flinches when any stick is raised, okay, in his vicinity. And I don't know, I kind of, to the extent that that's what you take away from these micro scenes in which pretty insignificant violence is done to the body of Lopakhin, are you not allowing the genre of tragedy to compel your attention in those moments? So much depends upon genre. So much depends upon genre, right? So much that, in fact, we may imagine that genres are fixed categories, static categories that don't change, and that the original genre is somehow given to us as though we didn't discover them or construct them ourselves as human beings over the course of whatever civilization, in the history of whatever civilization of which we were a part, that there's these fixed categories that probably transcend civilizations. So you have Chinese tragedies, right? Indian tragedies, you have African tragedies, you have American tragedies, Russian tragedies, right? And tragedy is just this category that just won't change. Well, not precisely, right? Not precisely, although the question is very complex. And we're not going to get to the bottom of some of these questions that I'm introducing. The important point is to introduce the questions and get you thinking about some of these topics right now, because I think it's going to make you better English majors, right? So turning to what you had to say, as Chris and Carly agree, The Cherry Orchard, whatever it is, certainly is not simply a comedy. As Chris notes, echoing Joanna's term, some of the social topics are a little too dark, especially the scene where suicide is brought up between Yepakhadov and Dunyasha. Michael asserts that, quote, "This play has elements of both comedy and tragedy. A reader may perceive The Cherry Orchard as a tragic play with comedic undertones, or as a comedic play with dark undertones." I thought that was very well said. Carly introduces the notion of a tragic comedy, or later, as she puts it, comic tragedy, which is discussed, tragic comedy, yes, by Abrams and Harfin, and makes me want to ask you, and this could almost be a discussion question, couldn't it? It's not, but it could be. Does it fit their definition? Does The Cherry Orchard fit the definition offered by Abrams and Harfin of the tragic comedy? Okay. Does it threaten tragedy but end up, this is one of the criteria, does it threaten to become a tragedy but end up ending happily as the way a comedy would? So that's where we get the tragic comedy, where even tragedy precedes in the term itself the structure of the term comedy, tragic comedy. So you get a sense of the sequence and the way that it works, although you can imagine it working the other way around, which we want to go back to Carly's notion of the comma tragedy, right? Hey, by the way, is not tragic comedy not so much a threat to the notion of genre, it's just a new genre. one which introduced further testifies to the power of genre to structure perceptions, etc. Right? So here's somewhere in the middle. Do you see where we are here? Somewhere in the middle between a hymn of praise of the extraordinary formative power of these fixed and static categories as though they were handed to us by some divinity. Tragedy, comedy, I guess tragic comedy, but that's my whole point here, is that tragic comedy seems to have arrived on the scene after tragedy and comedy have come into the realm. It's a more modern mode, okay? There probably are some tragic comedies. You can make the argument that they're tragic comedies further back in the tradition, but it's not a dominant genre, okay, on par with comedy and tragedy back in the Greek scene, right? In the ancients, amongst the ancients, they wrote tragedies and the comedies. They didn't have a category called tragic comedy. When they had their contests, they used to have these contests between these playwrights. They had a contest in tragedy. They did not have a contest in which people entered examples of tragic comedy. That is a more Johnny-come-lately genre, okay? So you can see what it testifies to, does it not? I mean, what I just said, you could say the emergence of tragic comedy as a genre in its own right speaks to the power of genre, right? Because when we get something that falls between two genres, we just come up with a new genre. At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to so it speaks to the staying power of specific genres, right? And the shall we say the power of that very term and concept genre, right? At the same time, it speaks, does it not, to the fact, as I said before, that they really can be mixed, as it were, okay? Although what comes out of the mix between fixed categories that turn out not to be fixed might itself be a genre, if you see what I'm saying. So you kind of get evidence of both possibilities there. The fact that it's not as though genres don't conceivably evolve, that they don't mutate, and that they don't mix, and kind of have offspring, as it were. Beautiful children, the beautiful child called tragicomedy, right? It's a child of tragedy and comedy. At the same time, tragicomedy comes into her own right as a powerful new genre that resists change, and that seems to last over many, many years, okay? If it's a viable, as it were, aesthetic offspring.
Still, don't some works fall outside existing genres? What about trifles? 200 Mod 1Q 1. What the heck is trifles if not a tragedy? Oh, and it's not a tragedy, correct? Or is it? If you walk up to a sad play with tragedy in mind, you'll see tragic elements. And how, if our discussion is any indication? This fact testifies not to the weakness of anyone's mind, but to the formative power of genre, of kind, of type, profile, and of raw expectation, of course. That's our major point here. Certainly I invited you to walk up to trifles with tragedy in mind. Little wonder that you did, at least a few did. Rachel fights a mostly lonely battle on behalf of the strong claim that we have tragedy per se, not just tragic elements in the play. Angelina joins her late in the thread, but only by displacing Mrs. Wright from the play center and naming Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters the tragic heroines of the play. Joe agrees that if the play is indeed a big T tragedy, this pair of protagonists are the heroes. Quote, the play is focused on the actions of Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. As Rachel argues, Trifles shares resemblances to Antigone. As in the latter play, the events that play out in Trifles are quite serious and impactful. And as Abrams and Harpham state, for Aristotle, tragedy is, quote, the imitation of an action that is serious. Rachel continues, Trifle is a tragedy, in part due to the character of Mrs. Wright, who has a tragic flaw. Mr. Wright, who drives her to the edge. He is her tragic flaw. Perhaps Rachel will allow this friendly amendment. Mrs. Wright's own tragic flaw, the one that she herself possesses as part of her own makeup, is that she felt the need to marry a guy like Mr. Wright to begin with, that she succumbed, perhaps, to the conventional need to marry at all. In order to substantiate that claim, we'd have to look into what we know about her past before she married Wright, and what her motive was for marrying him to begin with. Again, Angelina shifts focus from Mrs. Wright to the two erstwhile friends, who in a sense combine, she suggests, to form a tragic entity. Angelina admits, though, that neither suffers a, quote, drastic downfall, such as perhaps does Mrs. W, should she in the end be convicted. And who, thus, needs adding in? We thus have a trio of women combining so as to constitute a composite tragic hero. Joe, you claim that, quote, Trifles is clearly about the divide between men and women, and it highlights the dire consequences of such a thing. This is all very interesting, it seems to me. But is it the light, Joe spoke of highlighting, is it the light of tragedy, that very high light, that austere high light specifically, that shines on this problem? Dariah, Joe, and Laura would say no. Not on balance, even if Trifles does lie in what Joe calls the lineage of tragedy. For one thing, the play lacks a, quote, disastrous conclusion. This is something we've already seen mentioned. Mrs. Wright probably will not be convicted. There's that. Otherwise, what's the power of the ending? Even if she is this outcome, a prison sentence, let's say, even a death sentence, is that quite disastrous in the serious way that Crayon's is, or that Antigone's is? Going back to Crayon, his whole family dead, the state in disarray. As Rachel claims, individual members of a genre need not share all resemblances. This is that business of tragic elements, tragic characteristics. Quote, each member shares some of these resemblances with some, but not all of the other members of the genre. That's from Abrams and Harpham, the glossary. Quote, as Rachel adds, a work of writing need not tick off all the boxes in its main genre to remain in that genre. Laura agrees, and she also agrees that Trifles ticks off some of the boxes. There are characteristics of a tragedy hidden between the lines. Good, but the question is thus prompted, how many boxes? How many boxes then does it take? And are some boxes more important than other boxes? I would designate all of these questions genre questions. I would also designate them good questions. Many of you feel that the tragic hero box, for example, is indeed unusually important. And we don't have one, not really. Mrs. Wright may act heroically, but if so, the act happens off stage and prior to the drama, as so many of you noted, and I think intelligently. Quote, the tragedy must affect the protagonist, Jack says. And, quote, Mrs. Wright is not present in the play, as Mariah adds. Indeed, once the play begins, the focus shifts to Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters. Joe, quote, Mrs. Wright's story clearly already happened. The play is focused on the actions of Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale. And Maggie adds, Mrs. Wright is never given an opportunity to build her storyline or prove her honorable character. The, quote, reversal properly of interest to Jack, who was only following Aristotle when he pays attention to this particular component of tragedy, the reversal happens before the play even begins. That's not the way with tragedy. As for these two, the two women, as Maggie argues, their, quote, acts such as lying, deceiving, these acts humanize their characters. They make us, in a sense, kind of like them, but at the expense of, quote, detracting from their heroism. Heroes don't really lie, they don't conceal. They're not Ismenes. They are Antigones who do it out there in the open and suffer the consequences. Antigone, by contrast, is, quote, doing the noble or virtuous thing, sticking to her morals when her brother dies. These two are closer to Ismene, willing to deceive. Even Mrs. W, by the way, is simply not morally strong, Maggie argues. These simply are not honorable characters in a strong sense of the word honorable. This is not to say that they are dishonorable. They just don't have that big H honor associated with them. Dariah quotes the glossary on the tragic demand that, quote, passionate love conflict with the demands of honor. She wonders wisely, do we even have passion in the play any more than we do honor? Passion, with the kind of emotion that really demands that particular turn. And Joe wonders whether the play does not simply lack tragic magnitude, its central event lacking public consequence. Quote, what action did the women take? What consequences did it bring, compared to the consequences that Antigone's act brings? Question for Kendall. Does not Mrs. Hale's and Mrs. Peters' transgression seem small next to Antigone's? For Xavier, is the pity we feel for Mrs. W rich enough to qualify? Randy doubts that. Does it rise to the level of the grand pathos we feel contemplating Antigone's heroic stand and fatal destiny? One could say, following Joe, that, quote, society is the antagonist, the crayon of the play. But this move scarcely clarifies. Does a county commissioner, a little crayon, its representative, society's representative in a little crayon, seem big enough to attract the title tragic? Does this treatment of Mrs. W. and of the women gathered in her home evoke or stir, good word used by one of you, pity and fear, instead of simple disgust and contempt? Does Mr. W., for that matter, does he seem big enough? He's the crayon, maybe, because he, in a sense, is hoist on his own petard, right? He asserts himself, asserts his own prerogative, mistreats his wife. She takes action against him. But is he not the target of ridicule, despite, even the fact that he's dead? There just seems to be nothing large about him in life or in death. And I think you could say the same about the CC, the county commissioner. In which case we have not tragedy, but satire. A form, believe it or not, mostly technically speaking, of comedy. So that this play could conceivably be placed closer to comedy than to tragedy. Randy appears to favor something like this idea of the play as one which could be construed by the new historicists as treating, in this case satirically, quote, a contemporary social or ideological dilemma or phenomenon, social or ideological phenomenon, namely patriarchy. So you see what's happened here. We wondered about tragedy. Maybe we've moved up, maybe I've moved up at least, closer to comedy. In a rather circuitous motion we arrive, closer to comedy than tragedy.
Okay, then, so trifles maybe occupies not the space of an existing genre, but seems to point at something, I don't know, perhaps clearing space for some future genre, conceivably, itself a, metaphorically speaking, genetic mutation away from tragedy, which you see even in some of the decisions made by Glaspell, for example, chiefly that of moving tragic action off stage and placing us at a point outside of such action, beyond such action, where much of the significance of that action is still to be determined, right? It's not immediately present. There are all kinds of ways in which, in fact, we don't have what Aristotle seemed to think was required for a tragedy, and that again could be a nice little discussion question, but that's a good example of the kind of discussion question that would be better if this were a course on Renaissance tragedy, as opposed to a course which is all about an introduction to literature, right? So once again, there's certain topics that are just exceedingly interesting, probably to you as well as they are to me, that are not our proper focus because they just require that we go into too much detail in certain directions. It takes us away from the center line of what we're doing in the class, which has to do in this moment with genre, right? So let's offer something of a generalization at this point. Genres are in motion. They're not static. They're not static. They're stable now. They're not wavering all over the place, are they? We don't have these genres mutating wildly in any number of different directions over time, right? But I repeat, they're not static. They are mutable, okay? And I want to introduce a new concept here because it's an idea that we'll be employing. They're also modal, right? Now, what do we mean by that? We're going to get into Fowler here in a moment, not just to explain what one might mean by modal, but to confirm some of the points that we've just made. So let's just begin with Fowler, and I'll come back to this notion of mode here in a moment, which is something that we'll be employing down the road of the course. This is what Fowler has to say. Considering genres as families, by the way, Fowler's writing about himself. Can you imagine that? In this book, so when Fowler shows up, he's talking about himself. Considering genres as families, as Fowler did, Fowler notes, made it possible, even obligatory, to adopt a diachronic historical approach, and so offered a fresh approach to the problem of historical change. For Fowler, the so-called fixed historical kinds are not at all fixed but mutable, continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like, right? And I underline that statement because it struck me as important. For Fowler, and perhaps for us, the so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, perhaps tragic comedy, right? And we can get outside of genre thus considered, and talk about lyric, narrative, which is a kind of a different register of genre that we don't need to go into the differences right now, right? But narrative, lyric, and dramatic. And within dramatic, of course, we have comedy and tragedy, right? But for Fowler's so-called fixed historical kinds, comedy, tragedy, narrative, lyric, all the rest, they're not at all fixed. They're immutable. They are continually renewed repertoires of characteristic features, external structure, rhetoric, topics, and the like. For example, rhetoric in Antigone, you have the chorus speaking in a certain way that you don't have Creon speaking, right? And you have Antigone lamenting. You have like the lamentation over the death of the brother, which is a characteristic rhetorical trope that we find in Greek tragedy. External structure has to do with, we could go through some of the details there, but I think maybe you'd be good at naming them yourselves, right? External structure would have to do with the fact that we have a political situation, Creon, you have those in a lot of the Greek tragedies have, it's an affair of state that is at issue, right, in the story, the external structure, the social structure. It's a big cultural or social episode that is at the center of these, right, and that might even be fall more under the issue of topic. External structure might have to do with, like, even the sequence of, you remember Freytag's pyramid, where we have an exposition, then we have rising action, and we have a climax, which, denouement and all that stuff, right? Falling action and the denouement. What we have in tragedy, of course, is, for example, according to Aristotle, the recognition, anagnoresis, right, was the Greek term. We also have the scene of suffering, right? So we have all these conventions, hamartia, right, and hubris, the tragic flaw, and the tragic pride, which is at the heart of so many tragedies, right? These are those characteristic features that are continually renewed, and the repertoire is a continually renewed, as tragedy makes its way through the tradition, okay, according to Fowler. And the renewal itself is a sign of the mutability, okay, of the fixed historical kind known as the genre, because we do have little changes that you can see, for example, as you just go down the history like Senecan tragedy, revenge tragedy, all the different tragedies, Roman tragedy, you arrive at Shakespearean tragedy, make your way into more modern tragedy, and you see that it's still recognizable as tragedy, but it's not that there has not been no change, okay, in the kind. Now he goes on to say, such repertoires are not a means of classification so much as a source of signs and a language or coding system that allows economical yet intelligible communication. Quote, change of the repertoires is continual, for new works signify precisely by their modulating of specific previous states of the genre. Hence, their own addition to it modifies the existing state, and a series of such successive changes may alter it almost out of recognition. Yeah, I'm not going to argue with Fowler except to say that to the extent that it gets altered out of recognition, don't we have a different genre at that point? And maybe that's his point, is that, to the extent that it's not out of recognition, even if it comes close to being out of recognition, you can tell there that you still have tragedy, and it still deserves that term with a big T even, right? Which testifies once again to the power, though not, immutable and static, the power of genre, just as it exhibits this kind of power, what we call staying power, right? It just lasts. And he has more to say, and I've got some other stuff underlined down below, but I think this micro lecture is almost becoming a macro lecture at this point. Let me just read the last sentence. Throughout kinds of literature, the last underlined sentence, throughout kinds of literature, that's Fowler's own book. Throughout, I should say, kinds of literature represents, quote, genre as a continually dynamic metamorphosis whereby in the course of history, kinds are assembled, become more consciously practiced, form the basis of modes, enter into temporary mixtures, hybrids, and modulations, and combined to form new kinds. And that's where this idea of the mode comes in to play that I mentioned above. Told you I'd tell you something about. May wait till next time to talk more about this, because we're going to be talking about chorus, the chorus for next week. And we're going to be talking about how the chorus moves from a kind of feature of the genre, right, one of those characteristic features, to, I mean, it's still there as a feature, you know, when we get to Chekhov, when we get to perhaps even trifles, you see that we don't have some sort of form in the chorus. That'll be one of your questions, something related to that question. If we do not have, do we not have some sort of form, some sort of, you know, successive change, to quote Fowler? Yes, we'll have signs of successive change in the chorus, but we still have something that's not altered completely out of recognition. It still looks a little bit like a chorus, still sounds a little bit like a chorus. Do we not have that as we move forward? Okay, and as tragedy, you know, shows that indeed it's not immutable because it mutates, right? And you wonder whether that's not this thing that he's calling the mode, right? When you have a particular feature of you know, of a genre that seems to wander into some space outside of the genre where we don't have a recognizable tragedy anymore, but we have what's called the tragic mode showing up in a play that would seem to be of a different genre or of an indeterminate genre. And this is something we'll be talking a little bit about as we go through and go forward. I mean, as you can see, Fowler here thinks that, in fact, new genres sometimes come out of these wandering modes, which are, of course, little pieces, little portions of the repertoire, of the tragic repertoire, right? And little portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire kind of become mobile and wander out beyond the existing genre into their own space. A drama gets formed around them, so to speak, and before you know it, when enough people find this very compelling, we have a new genre, right? And maybe a couple of different modes wander out of, you know, maybe you could see this even with tragic comedy, that it's like certain portions of tragedy, portions of the repertoire, certain elements of the repertoire of comedy, wander, mix, we get tragic comedy. Okay, well, that's enough for today. Didn't go back to what I promised you last time. Broken promise then? I don't know. I don't know that you're going to lose a lot of sleep over this, but didn't go back to Matthew Arnold. I was intending to do that, but I just felt that no, just get directly to the business of the day, and you know, we can come back to that at on some future occasion. I think you did a very nice job on the whole question of the humanities, so it's a topic that I'm pretty happy with right now. So in any event, keep your eyes open for the new granular modular schedule that will be showing up. As you know, those tend to show up on Friday. And get the reading done. It will have the reading listed. And I will talk to you again next week. And of course, you'll have discussion board questions beginning to show up on Friday. So have a good weekend. Bye-bye.